Thank you. I was also a student of Yair and learned a great deal. I truly fear the moment that we might have to confront a possibility of a nuclear Iran in the Middle East. And I'm far more persuaded that we absolutely have to be there, although clearly the window of opportunity is diminishing. We're not going to talk about now what would it take to prevent Iran from doing so, but clearly, even if we were managed to extend deterrence or to leave under other conditions of deterrence, this would not be fun. So we better look for alternatives, and I think we need to focus the minds of how do we prevent Iranian nuclearization in the immediate future. But my talk is going to be not just Iran, but it's going to be beyond Iran, and it's going to be extended deterrence alongside deterrence. A couple of thoughts on extended deterrence before I try to give some answers, if you wish. The first question we have to think about is to whom is the deterrence extended? Is it extended to Israel, to the UAE, to the GCC, to Egypt, to Turkey? We heard already about the NATO extension of the nuclear deterrence to Turkey, but also to Iranian allies. By whom is the deterrence extended? Is it extended by the United States, by a like-minded coalition, by the P5, by NATO, and so on again, Iran to its allies? Against what or against whom is the deterrence extended? Is it extended against nuclear use? Is it against nuclear development? Is it against intimidation? Is it against non-nuclear, ballistic missiles, conventional, subversion, arms supply, cyber, whatever? I think it will be very difficult in Middle East conditions to distinguish one from the other, to say just this applies only to the nuclear but not to the other components. But then if you combine them, things become messier a great deal. How is the extended deterrence relationship anchored? Is it anchored in a treaty, in other type of a formal legally binding arrangement, in an informal arrangement, in an ad hoc arrangement? These are all going to be questions that will come to haunt us. Would strings be attached to an extended deterrence? Would the strings be attached that you have to conduct prior consultations, that you have to conduct coordination, that you would have to keep some indigenous capabilities as a result of the extended deterrence relationship? Should there be a local contribution of one kind or another, be it facilities, assets, funding, and so on? We have seen how that already happened in the Middle East. Would it be conditioned on some other aspects of conflict settlement, and so on? Would it be predicated on some arms control measures? All of these, I think, will be very profound questions in the Middle East. But also, I think we need to understand that the extended deterrence often is an extended reassurance as much as it's extended deterrence. Namely, you are trying to deter the adversary, but first and foremost, you're trying to reassure your ally. And in fact, your reassurance of the ally sometimes is the most important aspect that you're trying to accomplish, because you're trying to prevent him from taking things into his own hands, relying on his own capabilities, and things like that. So the question is, when we would think about extended deterrence, would it be more to reassure the ally or to deter his adversary? There is also an element of reassuring to the adversary. Reassurance that which could be either implied or explicit, that you're willing to tolerate his regime, that you're willing to accept certain capabilities in his hands, and so on. Again, this is going to be quite vexing when we come to the Middle East. And finally, all of this is, of course, couched in the discussion which we had with in the earlier sessions, and what's the relationship between all of this and arms control and disarmament issues. So let me now turn to the Middle East. Extended deterrence in the Middle East has been practiced a great deal over the years. It's been mainly provided by the United States, but also by the Soviet Union, to a lesser extent also by France and the United Kingdom. Occasionally, it's even been extended by coalition. It has also been applied by some Middle East parties, Egypt, the GCC, Iraq, and even Israel. You recall the Israeli extended of deterrence over Jordan. There have been many recipients in the region. On the whole, with the one major exception, it has not taken the form of a treaty. And even some of the peacekeeping arrangements have had an extended deterrence dimension to them. It has been anchored in either discrete understandings, in declaratory statements, in contingency planning exercises, in crisis resupply arrangements, occasionally in stationing of forces, and in some cases in permanent presence of forces. The French base in Abu Dhabi comes to mind, of course, the new base, and so on. It's been taken the form of putting global forces on alert, redeployment, sometimes deployment of fighting units in crisis, whether it's been missile defenses or naval forces, and occasionally even took the form of direct interjection of forces, say the U.S. reflagging of the Kuwaiti tankers, and so on. The nuclear dimension of extended deterrence in the Middle East never, in my judgment, involved serious willingness to use nuclear weapons. It was at most up there in the background, but never involved. I think it was important. I think it was relevant. But it was never seriously contemplating nuclear use, as we have come to appreciate. And I think Yair has given a lot of thought to this issue. So I think the nuclear issue has been implicit, which doesn't mean that it hasn't been something that given some thoughts to. And the purposes of the interjection of the nuclear dimension was usually to encourage proliferation, to deter WMD use, to dissuade Soviet intervention, and the like. What have been the motivations of extended deterrence in the Middle East? To guarantee oil supply, to safeguard key supplies and transit routes, to diminish incentive for proliferation, to lubricate arms sales. That is, if you're worried about Iran, I want you to buy my weapons, you want me to buy your weapons, then I ask you also for a bigger umbrella, and you can think of the concrete examples, and so on. Clearly a fear of a domino effect. Some cases there's been also an element of cultural affinity, and clearly there's also been the pressure of domestic lobbies that influences in some of those cases. Looking ahead, I think it's clear that further Iranian nuclearization is likely to be a defining moment for everybody. The anxiety is already building up even without Iranian nuclear weapons there, but just with the capability on the horizon, and also in conditions that do not concretely involve Iranian nuclear weapons as such. The problem in part is that Iran does see itself extending deterrence to its allies, as we have heard repeatedly, and some of its allies actually saying that they would step in the case that Iran is being attacked. We've heard statements to that effect as recently as last week from Hezbollah, to give you one example. But I also remind you that Iraq, after the 1990 speech by Saddam, was trying to extend the deterrence of others in the context of its chemical weapons capabilities. We have to bear in mind that unlike past events, and here I'm much less optimistic than Yair, the U.S. ability to shape events is significantly handicapped. It's significantly handicapped by growing awareness of its weakness, by its weariness from the conflicts it's already been involved in, and so on, by some neo-isolationist trends in Congress, and so on. So counting on the U.S. to actually step in and provide everything that we ask for may be asking a bit much. And furthermore, the U.S. is also reluctant to throw in the nuclear dimension because it is formally committed to disarmament and feels that it has to diminish the role of nuclear weapons rather than play it up. And I think that the U.S. effort to try and inject instead missile defense, particularly naval-based missile defense, is raising more questions than providing answers, in part because it's the same naval assets that are supposed to be deployed also in Asia, because they don't provide the same tripwire that ground forces provide. There are also some other considerations in mind. So we have to debate to a large extent to what extent conventional weapons as a whole can actually be a substitute to nuclear weapons in terms of extending deterrence, but also to what extent the U.S. by itself would be ready and able to provide an extended deterrence umbrella and all of this is going to create a much more complicated situation. Having said a few words about extended deterrence, which was not to debunk it, but just to say that if we actually to seriously contemplate it, we would find ourselves in a much more challenging situation, let me talk about nuclear deterrence in the region. And what I want to try and offer you is insights that have been developed both as part of studying the literature and talking to some of the leading practitioners in the field of how we actually need to think about a sort of a situation which one would want to rely on nuclear deterrence or mutual nuclear deterrence. The first point to understand is it's a very imperfect sort of instrument. Yair has already referred to some of the limitations. The efficacy is uncertain, and past performance is a limited guide for the future. It works best only when two parties are involved. But as Yair has implied, and others in the course of the day, we in the Middle East, the likelihood that we would only end up with two is rather limited, and therefore the lessons drawn from other contexts may not apply. It is most stable when serving as an instrument of the status quo. But clearly, as we've heard in the course of the day, the Iranians, but not just the Iranians, are not confined with retaining the status quo, which makes the practice of deterrence all the more difficult, because you face it with a situation of either losing credibility or getting into expanding and escalating the conflict with everything involved with this. It works best when there is mutual recognition, multidimensional dialogue, communication channels, and so on. Again, many of these aspects are lacking in the Middle East. It works best when there is rational, coherent leadership on both sides. This is necessary for escalation control. But if we just look at what's happening now within the Iranian leadership, so notwithstanding the fact that generally speaking the Iranians should be considered to be rational, incoherent leadership is clearly something that gets in the way of practicing deterrence and escalation control in a very effective way. Furthermore, to try and introduce deterrence and rely on it when there are serious existential fears, when the fears are based on a sense of struggle between totalistic ideologies and identities which involve total rejection of the other, again doesn't make deterrence all the more inspiring. When nuclear deterrence comes against the context of conventional asymmetry, it's again not a recipe of a stable delayed deterrence relationship, as we have increasingly seen between India and Pakistan in recent years, where the Pakistanis have drawn the opposite lessons than India of how to practice nuclear deterrence and are going for a first strike option and so on. Extended deterrence could complicate the equation even further by involving much more elaborate calculations which have more than two parties at stake. It is far less stable when you have a first strike capability, which clearly would be the case against Iran for many, many years to come. So the Iranians in a situation of use it or lose it would not be a particularly inspiring situation. And we've seen, again, many examples of that. But I think the most interesting aspect, and here I draw on one of my mentors, Mike Quinlan, who's pointed out that the most important lesson that he's been able to learn about nuclear deterrence and stable nuclear deterrence relationship is that it requires one fundamental thing, that both sides acquiesce with their own vulnerabilities. This requires such an incredible degree of maturity that you are willing to acquiesce with your own vulnerabilities and to live at that mercy. And by the way, those who want to draw on the U.S. as inspiration, the U.S. with respect to China is not yet there, amazingly. The U.S. is not willing to acknowledge that, and so the whole discussion of missile defense and so on. We have learned that newcomers to the nuclear field take a long time to socialize themselves, even if there are efforts of others to educate them, and may not come where you want. We have seen the aggressive behavior in North Korea. We've also seen aggressive behavior by Pakistan over an extended period of time. So even under the best of circumstances, when we have so-called, and excuse me for the political incorrect analogy, an extended nuclear pregnancy, we may have a more mature situation. But if those, for example, that are able to acquire nuclear capability quickly, Saudi Arabia, for example, in the context of Pakistani provision of nuclear weapons, would complicate things. And that the nuclear, as Jair has pointed out with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is a period of at least 15 years, which is stressful, conflict-prone, with considerable potential for escalation. And the ability to provide adult supervision under these circumstances. The Brits and the French have done it to India and Pakistan, but they've done it with limited success because the local parties felt proud enough that they can actually play cricket against the other and also manage a balanced deterrence relationship, and that has not been the case. Bottom line, from my perspective, we better not get there. If we will get there, it's going to be quite a difficult exercise, not unmanageable, but hugely demanding, in many ways present unprecedented challenges the world has yet faced in terms of the management of nuclear relationship. Thank you very much.